Hi, Scott. Welcome.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, excited to chat with you today. So let me maybe kick things off with a quick introduction of who you are. So former president at AdRoll, president and CEO at Frame.io, acquired by Adobe back in 2021. Now you're the CEO of NoFraud, which is an e-commerce solution or fraud prevention solution.
Yep.
And yeah, you've had an awesome, illustrious career. There's a ton more in store for you, I'm sure. But you've been in the COO seat a couple of times. You're intimately familiar with the chief of staff role as well. So
Yep.
I'm excited to dive right in here. Maybe we can start things off by, can you share a little bit about kind of the biggest inflection points in your career?
Yeah. Well, it goes way back. I wanted to be a pro hockey player, but in the off chance that a kid from Jersey wasn't going to make it to the NHL, which, pretty good chance of that. And also I wasn't good enough to play in the NHL, but I did okay for myself. But I took, a role, this like predates Google and some of this stuff, as like a grunt researcher for a small family office or private equity fund, and did a bunch of things with them. And it kind of gave me the bug for early stage companies and businesses. And then when I did go to college and all through, I continued to do work there. When I came out of school, I got to be I was sort of thrown into a role that was way bigger than what I was sort of ready for, which was running a large sales force at a solar energy company. And I sort of attacked that in kind of a creative way, put me on the radar for a company called Careerbuilder. So like if you connect the dots going back, it kind of logically progresses in an interesting way. But I think, I was sort of quickly in a role that was way bigger than what I was capable of doing and had to learn fast on the job. I realized that I didn't know what I was doing. So I think maybe I've been lucky to always be self-aware and not be in a hurry. It's sort of funny. I've always taken roles that are bigger than what I've ever done. I've always been comfortable sort of signing up and figuring it out. Probably you could call it even borderline arrogance, or maybe not borderline, but cocky enough to figure it out. But I think that part served me well, but also kind of aware and humble enough to know that I didn't know a lot, and to put good people around me. So I was always sort of good at the team building side and everything else. I think kind of like the biggest one for me, AdRoll was a really interesting role because, I joined the company. I'd learned enough over my career to know that I didn't want to work inside of a really big company and be lost, right? But I knew that I enjoyed like running teams and leading people and all that jazz. I also learned that I was really a mission-driven person. Like when I was doing solar energy, I felt great about bringing solar to the world. When I was running, sort of mid-market business at Criteo, I didn't really care about helping Macy's make an extra $5 on an average transaction. It didn't like do it for me. The technology was really fascinating. I was enamored by that space, especially coming from like the HR tech world. And prior to that, I was a career builder, and that felt good about connecting people with jobs. Like there's all these places where I always could connect to what we were trying to do. And so when I ended up at AdRoll, after two other exits prior to that, and I actually really didn't care about the job. I love the mission. I thought the space was interesting. I love the e-commerce sort of entrepreneur and helping to serve kind of that early stage company. So I think those were some of like the key learnings. And then for me, it was just one of those situations where I was like, hey, we got this problem over here. Can you figure it out? And I said, sure, come in, I'll figure it out. And 3 weeks later, there was another problem. 3 weeks later, another problem. And, pretty quickly that job ballooned into a pretty big role. I ended up running SMB, scaling that. I was sort of always wanted to run a bigger operational sort of business that way because, I sort of looked at like Sheryl Sandberg's career and kind of like always thought highly of her. I've always been fascinated by how she's just a brilliant person, and so that was really important. But I always kind of enjoyed the building piece, enjoyed connecting the dots. I always kind of lived in the middle of sort of product and go to market, and so just kind of tricked up there, and then that was a big role. I left AdRoll. I loved that company, did a bunch of really fun things, loved the people, loved the mission. And I left for, personal reasons. Just I was traveling a ton, wanted to be closer to home. And then ended up at Frame. Obviously we had a really nice run at Frame, and everybody was pretty happy with the outcome there. I tried to be fun employed for like 2 weeks. I made everybody in my life crazy. I renegotiated my landscaping, contract, my cable bill. I started meddling with like the kids' schedules, and my wife was like, "Get out of here." And so then I was like, did a fractional kind of thing for a while, for about a year. But I'm an operator at heart. I love building companies, teams, etc. And when I found NoFraud, the assets, technology, all of it was really exciting. And I love the customer, right? We serve kind of that mid-size, ambitious, growing entrepreneur e-com business, and it's a place that I know well. I love that space, and so it's been fun to kind of build that. So I've been in this seat for about a year, and really lucky to hire and have great people around me over the years, and hopefully continue to do that.
That's an awesome story. Thanks for the deep dive there. When was the first time you encountered the chief of staff role? Kind of what were your initial thoughts, and has that evolved over time?
Yeah, so I've had a chief of staff. So at Criteo, I had a chief of staff, and that was my first time doing that. Running kind of a horizontal business, it was helpful to have somebody. And really, initially, it was kind of a personal sort of strategic project manager kind of a deal, right? It was we have initiatives, they need to get pulled through, and making sure that somebody could corral all that. It evolved pretty fast for me in my thinking in AdRoll. I got a lot of clarity around the role. So I've kind of had a chief of staff / like head of ops, for a long time. I've not COO, but I want to separate the two things.
Right.
And so, for me, the chief of staff, special projects and leading initiatives is still one of the pillars, I think. And for me, at least on the chief of staff side, a lot of times it's incubating net new functions or concepts that just there's no person to put them under. And frankly, it requires a lot of thinking and sort of, you got to do the job, figure it out, maybe build a small team, incubate it to a certain size. And then potentially we park it under different, leaders once it's a little bit more mature versus trying to have somebody build it from scratch. The other sort of thing is like there's an operations function that's supposed to help the company to run more successfully. I think there's a chief of staff role supposed to make your sort of leadership team, that core group be more effective. Obviously,
right.
The leader of that group, whether it's I think it was reserved for a long time for the CEO. I really don't believe that's right. I think that every leader at a certain stage benefits from this, from that function. And then the last is a lot around communication and cadence, right? Just helping to play that role. I think certain profiles can be a proxy in different rooms, obviously, and do those types of things. But really, it's you got to make sure that you're enabling them. But they're a senior member of the team. I think for a long time it was conflated with like an EA kind of a role, right? That was kind of like the journey of the chief of staff. I think people are realizing this is really a critical. It's an executive function inside of an organization in a lot of ways, and so it's been a great breeding ground. I mean, a lot of the chief of staffs that I've had have gone on to do really big jobs, either for me or for others, and it's just a really important function. So I've leaned on it pretty heavily for probably a decade.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I agree with everything you said and the characterization of the role, and that it's a huge launching pad for someone's career. And the way I like to frame it too is it's the person that allows the CEO to really focus on like working on the business versus working in the business. And you mentioned that you wanted to make a distinction between the COO role and the chief of staff role, and that you've been in conversations before where you've kind of had to really, maybe even painful conversations, right, to really draw out the differences between the two. So what would you highlight there as the biggest differences?
Well, I think first, the COO role is a very hard job, and it's a very complicated job because it's arguably the most ambiguous executive role, if not the most ambiguous executive role that there is. And a lot of times, especially in early and mid-stage companies, COO roles get introduced either because you have title inflation, and so you're just naturally like adding, some sales manager is a VP of sales, and you're the VP of sales is actually a CRO, and then you want to actually go hire a CRO. So you're like, well, make him a COO. It's like, that's not a great framing. Redpoint did this great interview, this fireside chat with Allison Pickles, like many years ago. I don't know if you know who she is, but she's really a great thought leader around the COO space, and somebody I would encourage you to chat with. But they talked about sort of like the 4 archetypes of the COO. And I'd argue there's a fifth. There's the chief of staff archetype, right? There's the CFO plus archetype, which is, obviously CFO plus some operational roles like HR, legal, et cetera, relatively common. There's the CRO plus profile, which is the go-to-market leader that probably owns some biz ops functions and some other things. And then there's and then there's kind of like the number 2 role, right? Which is the role I play, which is basically that's a CEO that can run the company and allow the CEO to focus in the areas that they spike, right? The 1 or 2 pockets where they really do it. Or in large organizations, they run the company and the CEO is more market facing and spending their time in that way. And I think I'd argue the fifth profile today is the CHRO, or the chief people officer. I think that there's a world, you're seeing just a much different profile archetype for the CRO, or the chief people officer. And these are people that think about, they understand how to connect business strategy. They've got really strong acumen, and they think about how to execute the strategy through the lens of the people we have and the resources we have today. To me, that's just like a natural progression into the COO role and the CEO role of the future. And so I think that's been coming for some time, and there's some really brilliant, like I've been very fortunate to have phenomenal people leaders, working with me on my teams. And I can tell you for certain, like a lot of them I would have slotted as a COO over somebody else. But the distinction in my mind, though, is like, I don't think the glorified, and this is like, has a negative connotation, but it's not intended. This glorified COO that is in fact the chief of staff is actually a disservice to the chief of staff, right? Because I do think the chief of staff's function and scope is relatively focused, right? A lot of it is project-based work, or everything has kind of a shelf life, right? Because there's an intention to make yourself obsolete as you incubate some of these new ideas, right? There's initiatives and things you're driving that are distinct. You're a really excellent program and project manager, but the COO role actually owns aspects of the organization. There are things that inevitably roll into them that they're responsible for commanding, directing, the troops. And I don't think that's the appropriate lens to think about the chief of staff. It's not uncommon that a COS would graduate into a role like that, potentially, likely, a lateral move and then something like that. But it is not the same thing. And I think oftentimes CEOs look at, especially founders will look at their team, their business, they'll say, man, the company's really grown fast. The leadership team hasn't quite caught up yet. And rather than doing the really hard thing, which is having those honest conversations and either layering the team with the right leadership going forward, or replacing them functionally, right, with people that are ready for the next leg of the journey. And it's always such a taboo thing. I don't understand why it has to be taboo. But I think if you're honest and open about expectations, how they evolve, you can be fine. But anyway, so I think oftentimes they'll push for that and they'll bring their COO in, when in fact what they really need is somebody to just help them like stay organized as the business scales and stay on top of things, like you said, allow them to continue working on the business but not be dragged into every conversation, right? So that I can say, hey, I need you to go find out this isn't working right. Spidey senses are tingling. I need you to go dig in on this and try to figure it out. Now, there's certain areas you should never delegate, right? Like the old Jack Welch sort of mantra, like if you're the best in the business at this particular thing, then you're going to go, right? When he went to American Standard to figure out how they were making all those turns on the in the production plant. Like, he grew up in production, he knew production, he wasn't going to delegate that to somebody else. Whereas there were big things that everybody would think was only the CEO's decision. He's like, well, there's a smarter person than me in the room, so if they're going to come back to me and tell me what's what. And I think, that's why I think the chief of staff also has been thought of as this hybrid of like, an EA role. And by the way, I don't think there's anything negative about the EA role either.
Sure.
But they're often conflated, and some EAs are able to make that transition, and it's brilliant, and they've got that level of acumen. Others, that's not an area that's of interest for them, so they don't. But I think you can easily conflate having somebody that can just pull things together for you and execute for you from somebody who can actually run parts of the organization. And when CEOs think they hire a COO, but they actually want a chief of staff, they quickly find out that somebody else has a lot of thoughts and ideas about how to run their company, and that they're not ready for that. A chief of staff is also challenging thinking, bringing ideas to light, helping to bring certain things up to speed. But the roles are very clear, in terms of the roles and responsibilities. So I know, long-winded way of answering it, but I think they are very distinct, and I wouldn't really put them into the same bucket. I think they're different things.
I fully agree. I mean, the three ways that I think about the differences between the COO and chief of staff is across company objectives, people, and their like lens of focus. So the chief of staff usually isn't owning company-wide objectives. They don't have anyone reporting into them, typically, right? They're a hardcore individual contributor, and then their lens of focus is on their CEO or whoever their principal is, whereas the COO is like certainly owning multiple company-wide objectives, has potentially multiple teams reporting into them depending on the size of the org, and their lens of focus is the organization. So just those are the kind of the biggest distinctions for me. So yeah, there's definitely overlap between the roles in terms of.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they work. By the way, they work really closely together. I mean, that if you do have a COO function and a COS function, those aren't in conflict, but you have to do it right. And you have to, like, there's certain functional areas that you start to question. You just have to be really crisp about remit and sort of areas where do things start and stop. If you have a biz ops type of function or a PMO type of function inside the organization, even if it's a single or 1-2-person team, being really crisp about where the COS starts and ends, or maybe the function should live under the COS, since the chief of staff is going to actually have a really good command of like what are the company level initiatives and key projects, and how to help support those things. But yeah, they are very different. I think the way you said it is exactly right.
So what would you say is, let's say, something that the chief of staff could trip up on if they're, let's say, stepping into the role for the first time, or maybe aren't aware of how to advocate for themselves, or being able to look around corners for themselves, not just their CEO?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things. One, it's really, you're not the proxy overnight, right? Kind of a deal. You want to be, because you want to take things off the plate of the principal. You want to do whatever those things are, but you've got to really understand how to build relationships, build trust, and create value, like help move things faster, take things faster. And so I think there's real effort that has to go into that. I think, you have to come to the table. It's a really hard job. Like, I think it's an incredible job. It's an incredible opportunity. You learn a ton. You're exposed to so much. I think the hardest part when chief of staffs of mine would move into other roles is they felt like they lost touch with, the ELT sort of conversation, right? You go from being in boardrooms in a lot of cases, right? Like really understanding and hearing all the things to then, and that context is so powerful when you go and eventually move into running a different type of group or doing a different role. But there's a little bit of a hangover of like, wait a minute, I feel disconnected. I'm not in the room anymore. But the relationship is always strong. That part's good. It's obviously a springboard. but I think it's sort of forging the right relationships. I think it's coming to the table, with the right kind of framing. You have to have really good acumen, really good instincts, but the right sort of frameworks so that you can take things out of meetings, because you're in a ton of meetings. I mean, that's the other hard part, is like you're in a ton of meetings, and then afterwards there's a ton of work to do. And so how do you like strike the right balance and pull all that stuff together? So it can be tough sledding at times. And that's why there's like frameworks and that capability to really pull that stuff together, be really a great, clear, concise communicator. There's a lot of tools available to you today that can help you move faster, but all that stuff is hard. But I think I've seen folks just trip up, and they didn't forge the right relationships out of the gate. They didn't spend the time to really learn and develop. They weren't really crisp and clear with the CEO, and it's on the CEO or the principal, but oftentimes you've got to steer it and drive it. And that's what I kind of speak to, is get really crisp. What is the job today? What are the priorities? What are the roles and responsibilities? How do you want me to think about budgeting time? I think they oftentimes also, just because, especially early in the role, you're trying to make a good impression like anywhere else. And so you just say yes to everything, and you don't do a great job on the prioritization. I mean, CEOs, speaking for myself included, we're the worst. Like, all we do, our brain just doesn't stop coming up with new things we could do. And like, there's a company backlog that could go a century long of stuff that we could do. And so, a good chief of staff has to establish those relationships with others, but also with the CEO, to make sure that you can sit down and talk. Okay, what are the priorities? You got to learn the person, understand the person, be able to speak in their voice. All that stuff is just like hard things. So I think just that onboarding period is really hard. Getting crystal clear about roles, responsibilities, what the job is, building a roadmap, managing the priorities, making sure you're kind of sitting across all the right things. Because it bobs and weaves a lot, and so that can be kind of daunting at times. I also think some folks jump into that role never having worked inside an organization. Like, you see a lot of folks. I think it used to be the consultant would come, and a lot of times consultants don't own anything. It's nothing against the consulting world, but they're not accustomed to actually having to see something really all the way end to end. And so I think it does help a ton to have some operational experience, some leadership experience. I think oftentimes COSs are seen wrongly as a very junior role. In fact, I think they're actually a very senior role. Like when I left Frame.io after the acquisition, I did this fractional executive thing for a lot of CEOs, but I was essentially a chief of staff. It was, sure. And your role is to help the CEO think things through, be kind of a whisperer in different conversations, be a sounding board. And that's hard to do if you don't have any experience inside the business. I think oftentimes people see it as like a step back, when in fact, if you could be a director level, senior director level, VP level, and move into a chief of staff role, and you're only going to be that much more effective, right? So anyway.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate your candidness. I mean, you said CEOs are the worst, or you're not going to be the proxy overnight. Maybe that comes from, the New Jersey roots. We talked about this earlier. We're both from Jersey.
A town over from each other. Incredible.
I appreciate, the candidness, and also, strong opinions strongly held. But I'm curious to hear, like, is there anything that you believe in today that you didn't a year ago?
Whew. That's a long list. No, I mean, specific to the chief of staff role.
It could be anything. It could be business or life or anything.
Look,
really.
I think we've all seen and learned hard lessons. I've had to lay off huge chunks of people, earlier in my career, and I've always taken, and a lot of folks that frankly didn't have any control over their destiny. And I think a lot of companies have gotten bloated, and people are anxious about all this stuff. But I think, teams need to be lean and excellent as long as possible, mm-hmm. right? You got to collapse sort of the talent stack inside your organizations with a lot of people that can wear different hats. There's this old article about guns and ammo, or barrel ammo. And it has a terrible connotation. But the idea is like, it doesn't matter how much intellectual horsepower you have, you can only get as much done as you have people that can execute and see things all the way through. And I think, we used to solve for this with lots of leadership layers and other things. And actually, what I would say is that the chief of staff role at multiple tiers inside of organizations, right, not just reserved for the CEO, can actually be a huge agent of progress, velocity and change in your business. And so as folks are thinking about how do we run these teams really lean and effective, this sort of go-between function that can wear a lot of different hats and oversee a lot of different things can help to execute and extend kind of your reach as a leader is a really important lever in my opinion. So I think that stuff's all true. Obviously, it's going to be really interesting to see how technologies like AI are leveraged in how companies actually operate on a day-to-day basis. Everybody wants to have the shiny object on the AI front, but actually, there's a lot of internal stuff that I think will be an unlock. And I think putting that in the hands of really good cross-functional operators that can just execute in a lot of different ways, it could be a force multiplier for the function. So
love it.
But
love it.
No, most things are just have a way of coming in and out of flow.
And then last question to wrap. If you could send a one-sentence text to yourself 15 years ago, what would it say?
Take a breath.
Take a breath.
I think I've said this before. I am notoriously bad at not sort of pausing and celebrating kind of progress, and even just frankly having gratitude for things. I'm always like, the second I cross a threshold, it's just how I'm wired. I'm always like, before I even get to the goal line, I've already moved it, and it's fine for me. It's heavy for everybody around me. So, being better at sort of celebrating the wins, the progress, enjoying the moment kind of deal.
Yeah.
So
I love that.
I send a text to myself every day now, but it's,
that's
it's
great. Yeah. Set it on, automate it. Right.
Yeah.
Well, that wraps up our time together for today. Thanks for sharing your insights, Scott.
I appreciate the time and really excited about what you're building on your end. I think it's a really important area of the business that hasn't been given enough structure and focus. So glad to see somebody sort of leading the charge on that. So congrats.
Thanks, Scott.